Today is like a homecoming. Our speaker is someone who, be seated. All right. Someone that I've watched all my life because I was a UVA law student when Alan Dershowitz and my father would often have friendly debates on, I guess back then it was CNN. I don't know which, it was one, there weren't as many news networks back then as there are now, but he was the lawyer in the O.J. Simpson case, which began in January of 1995. He was part of the dream team with F. Lee Bailey, Johnny Cochran, Robert Kardashian, Robert Shapiro. He clerked for Supreme Court Justice Arthur Goldberg. He went back to academia after that. He was at Harvard Law School and at 28 years old. He's published more than 1,000 articles in magazines, newspapers, journals, blogs, New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal. He's got the lead editorial in today's Wall Street Journal. He held the professorship, the Felix Frankfurter professorship there at Harvard from 1993 until his retirement in 2013. He was known for his focus on civil liberties as an attorney, but over the course of his career, he's garnered an array of accolades, including an appointment, as I said, to the Felix Frankfurter Fellowship of Law at Harvard University and a 1979 Guggenheim Fellowship. He won 13 of 15 murder and attempted murder cases that he handled. He represented several high-profile clients over the course of his career. He heiress turned bank robber. This is way before your time, but Patty Hearst, businessman Klaus von Bülow, filmmakers Woody Allen and Roman Polanski. He represented televangelist Jim Baker, hotel tycoon Leona Helmsley, boxer Mike Tyson, WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange, and socialite Gigi Jordan. He's a prolific author. He's written 30 fiction and nonfiction works with a worldwide audience, including the New York Times #1 bestseller, Chutzpah, and 5 other national bestsellers. Some of his other books include Reversal of Fortune, Reasonable Doubts, The Best Defense, The Advocate's Devil, Supreme Injustice, How the High Court Hijacked the Election in 2000, The Case for Israel, Taking a Stand, My Life in the Law, Rights from Wrongs, The Case for Peace, The Case Against Impeaching Trump, and The Case Against BDS, Why Singling Out Israel for Boycott is Anti-Semitic. He's a regular media contributor. You can't turn on hardly any news channel without seeing Alan Dershowitz at some point. He's written, taught, and lectured about history, philosophy, psychology, literature. He's been called the nation's most prominent civil liberties lawyer and one of its most distinguished defenders of individual rights. The best-known criminal lawyer in the world, the top lawyer of last resort. He was awarded the Soviet Jewry Freedom Award by the Russian Jewish community. The thing I've admired about Alan, I could go on and on with his resume here because it's just another whole page, but it's just incredible what he's accomplished in one lifetime. And what I've always admired about him is he never let his political views influence he was always, in his opinion about the law and about the Constitution, he was always fair, stayed true to what the original intent was, and he was one of a very few people that did that. And he's just been somebody I've admired from a distance for a long time. And so I wanted you to hear from him. It's not many university students that get to hear from someone of his stature. And so welcome, please, to Liberty University. We have a scissor reel, a video to show quickly, but please welcome after the video to Liberty University, Alan Dershowitz.
And there's massive evidence that the easy ability should dare the Republicans to say, can't have law. You can have a Democrat. That's why I voted for Hillary Clinton for Obama. I didn't vote for Donald Trump. I'm not here to defend him. I'm here to defend civil liberties and due process.
Together, everybody. For the one, the only, Alan Dershowitz is in the house. Such an honor to have him here. So much to talk about, such a storied career, but can we just go to the beginning and talk about your just your childhood and how some of the ways that just the Lord brought you up into this world actually ended up causing you to choose law as your profession. And also, I'd love to hear a little bit about your earlier connections with this university as far as with our founder as well.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. Wow, this is an amazing, amazing event, an amazing place. I wish all Americans could see this and hear the songs that joined you together. It's just absolutely remarkable. I am blown away. This is my second visit. I had a wonderful, if sometimes contentious, relationship with the Reverend Jerry Falwell, the founder of this great university. We used to tease each other a lot on television. And when I wrote my own book on the Bible called The Genesis of Justice, he volunteered to write a blurb, an endorsement for the book, but his endorsement said that my book was blasphemy at its best. That was the Reverend Jerry Falwell. And so I was blessed as to when and how I was brought up. I was brought up in a modern Orthodox Jewish community in Brooklyn right after the Holocaust. Many of my relatives were murdered in the Holocaust. Some of my friends in elementary school had numbers on their arms. They had survived Auschwitz and Birkenau. And when you were brought up in that environment and background, you couldn't help but be a civil libertarian, someone who loved liberty and someone who supported due process. I was also 10 years old when the dream of my people came to fruition and Israel was reestablished as the nation state of the Jewish people. I say reestablished because it had existed, as you all know, during the time of Jesus and for many years before that. So I was brought up at an incredibly wonderful, wonderful time. Also, I was brought up at a time when America was expanding, the economy was expanding. I remember when I saw Jackie Robinson come to bat for the first time in Ebbets Field, the first African American, and I said to myself, if an African American man can play second base for the Brooklyn Dodgers, a Jewish kid from Brooklyn can accomplish anything. And we grew up in that kind of environment. I was not a good student in elementary school or high school. I went to Jewish parochial school, and I didn't get along that well with the rabbis. One day, the principal, a rabbi, an Orthodox rabbi, called me in and said, Dershowitz, we got to figure out what we're going to do with you. You got a good mouth, but you don't have such a good brain. He said, you should pick a job where you use your mouth but not your head. He said, I have two suggestions. Remember, he was an Orthodox rabbi. He said, I have two suggestions. One, you could be a conservative rabbi, or two, you could be a lawyer. Now, I wasn't smart enough to be a rabbi, so I became a lawyer. I was always a lawyer. From the time I was born, I argued with everybody. I never accepted anything just because somebody told me that. And so I became a lawyer. And of course, growing up where I grew up, in the shadow of the Holocaust, I became a defense lawyer. I wanted to defend people. I marched in the South against segregation. I opposed the death penalty. I opposed McCarthyism. All through my youth, I tried to stand up for a liberty. And I think what I have become is a product of my religious upbringing. I studied the Bible. I was a deeply religious and committed Jew. I learned the Talmud, but also because of the time that I grew up, following the Holocaust, the establishment of the State of Israel. And thank God, I was lucky. I was lucky. I was born at a good time, and I've tried to pay back what I've done. I do half of my cases free, pro bono. I represent people who can't afford me. I have to admit, when I can represent somebody who can't afford me, I charge them, and I charge them good. And I give a substantial portion of that to help people who can't afford me. So thank you again for inviting me here. I'm really looking forward to some probing questions from both of you here on the stage with me.
Well, you know, I remember from my days in law school and after watching you on TV, and you were considered a liberal, but you always said, I may not agree with you, but I'll die for your right to say it.
Right.
And you were telling me in the back room that some of your colleagues still feel that way. But there's a new radicalism on the left that doesn't seem to agree with that. And that's why the president signed the free speech on campus executive order yesterday. I was at the White House.
Congratulations for your role in having him do that. That's really a very important step forward for all of Americans.
Thank
right?
you, thank you. I was there at the White House for the signing, and he made it clear that if colleges and universities keep disinviting conservative speakers, keep ridiculing conservative students in the classroom, that they lose federal research dollars, and it's a lot of money. It's billions of dollars. But I went on PBS NewsHour live last night, right afterwards, and I was arguing against a fellow who said, there's no liberal bias. Liberals get disinvited just as much at colleges as conservatives, but I couldn't get him to give me one example. And so I remembered a speech by former New York City Mayor Michael Bloomberg while I was sitting there on the set at Harvard a few years back, where he chastised the Ivy League because he said 96% of the faculty and staff had donated to the Obama administration. And he said, how can you have free expression of ideas, academic freedom, when 96% of the faculty are of one persuasion? And so that was the key point I tried to make. But what do you think? But the thing that bothers me the most about the new radicalism, of course, the lack of free speech on campus is a terrible thing, and that's what college is supposed to be about. But what bothers me more is there seems to be an anti-Semitic thread to this new radicalism, and I couldn't believe they were attacking Chelsea Clinton for speaking out against anti-Semitism and accusing her of being Islamophobia. Yeah. I actually tweeted about that, and I found out last night that you had written an article at the same time that I tweeted about it. Tell us what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I think what's going on university campuses today is much of like what went on when I was a college student. When I was a college student, I lived through McCarthyism, where people were attacked for their beliefs. I hated communism. I grew up in a house where Stalin was almost as bad as Hitler. But I defended the right of teachers and individuals to express views different from my own. And for many, many years, between McCarthyism and what's now called progressivism, it's a terrible term, it's really regressive, not progressive, there wasn't a sense that you could speak your mind at university campuses. Today, that's not true. Today, unless you speak on behalf of kind of identity politics, on groupthink, radical left views, you're not really encouraged to come on campus. I'm a liberal, and I have been banned and shut down on university campuses because I support Israel. And if you support Israel, you're regarded as a, quote, Zio-fascist, even though Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. And even though I'm sometimes critical of some Israeli policies, everybody should be critical of every government's policies. That's the nature of democracy. But the worst thing is the intolerance that the hard left has toward dissenting views. It's amazing, and I think every American should know this, that you have invited me to speak here today, even though we have some fundamental disagreements about some social issues, about some political issues, about some religious issues. But you welcome me with open arms. The obverse is not true. Somebody with your views would not be welcome to speak today at major Ivy League universities. I'd be there defending you. I'd be there introducing you. I'd be proud to have you as a speaker on my campus, but you would be shut down. There would be efforts to what's called deplatform you, which is a fancy word of saying censoring you, not letting you speak. And when you get a congresswoman like Congresswoman Omar from Minnesota saying that Jews control and hypnotize the world, and it's only because of dollars and the Benjamins, and Jews have dual loyalty, and Chelsea Clinton correctly calls her out on it, and then she gets attacked and called Islamophobic. It's simply a way of trying to silence criticism. It's a way of trying to say, if you criticize bigots and anti-Semites, you will be called a bigot and an Islamophobe. And Chelsea apologized. I wish he hadn't apologized.
Me too.
I wish he would stand up for her principles. I would never apologize for telling the truth and criticizing bigotry, whether it's bigotry against Christians. And let me tell you, whenever there's bigotry against Jews, the Christians are next. The bigots who hate Jews hate Christians, and they hate America for the most part, and they're coming after you after they come after me. So we're in this together.
That's right.
And we have
That's
to defend and support free speech and religious freedom.
Tell the story of, my father was one of the first to lead, the first evangelicals to promote the idea of evangelicals really need to support the state of Israel for all the reasons you just said. But tell the story about what happened the first time Benjamin Netanyahu came to the United States.
Benjamin Netanyahu's first visit to the United States after he was elected prime minister in 1996, the first person he came to see was the Reverend Jerry Falwell. He wanted to express appreciation for, at a time of diminishing support for Israel on the left, increasing support for Israel among evangelical Christians. And evangelical Christians, we know, love Israel, support Israel, are among the strongest supporters of Israel, and so it was understandable for the Prime Minister of Israel to show his respect for the great Reverend Jerry Falwell. The Clintons didn't like that because Reverend Falwell had made some very critical statements about the Clintons. And the Clintons really let Benjamin Netanyahu know what they felt. And Netanyahu called me and asked me if I would speak to Bill Clinton, who is a friend of mine, and explain to him why it was the right thing to do. And I have to tell you, I did explain, and Bill Clinton understood. Hillary Clinton, not so much. But Bill Clinton clearly understood. He understood when you're the prime minister of a country, you have to put your country's interest first. And the interests of Israel were to show appreciation to the Reverend Falwell and to show respect by meeting him on his first trip. So I'm proud of the Prime Minister for doing that. I'm proud of the Reverend Falwell for welcoming the Prime Minister of Israel. It's better than what some Democratic senators did when Netanyahu spoke in front of Congress about the Iran deal, opposing the Iran deal, which every decent person should have opposed the Iran deal. Many Democratic senators refused to attend. They would have come to hear Castro, they would have come to hear Arafat, they would have come to hear people who are major deniers of human rights, but they refused to come to hear the Prime Minister of Israel. And even today, as you watch the news, some of the Democratic candidates for president refuse to attend the AIPAC meeting in Washington. AIPAC is the pro-Israel lobby in Washington. And that's a serious mistake. Israel is a great ally of America, and we should work together to fight against terrorism, extremism, and all other kinds of evils that are in the Middle East. Israel is America's strongest ally, most reliable ally. Nobody knows who's going to be in charge of Egypt tomorrow, or Jordan, or Saudi Arabia, or Syria, or Lebanon. Everybody knows that no matter who's elected in Israel, it will be a democratic election, and whoever that prime minister is will support the United States of America, militarily, with intelligence, and in every other possible way. It's a great alliance, and a great alliance between Christian Americans and the State of Israel.
I couldn't agree more. A good friend of mine who's a Jewish fellow called me last night from New York City, and he was so proud because he went to Cornell, and the president of Cornell just wrote a letter yesterday attacking BDS.
Right. BDS means boycotting, discriminating against, divesting, and sanctioning only one country in the world, the nation state of the Jewish people. It's anti-Semitic to its core, and many students are pushing for that, including Congresswoman Omar and 2 other recently elected congresswomen.
But he was just so happy about that. When he heard you were coming, he wanted me to mention that today.
Oh, appreciate that.
Yeah,
Thank you.
But we, one question I want to ask you is, what advice, if President Trump were sitting here right now and you could give him any advice that you wanted to give him, what would it be?
I gave him advice on television. I said, don't tweet, don't pardon, and don't testify. And the other bit of advice I would say is you're the President of the United States, and you have to watch your language. You have to make sure that you don't engage in the kind of language that we just don't expect from a president. But you judge a president by many factors. For me, bipartisanism means that I support a president who I didn't vote for. I did not vote for Donald Trump, but I supported his move of the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem and Israel, and I said so. I supported what he said just yesterday about the Golan Heights remaining within Israel. I support many of his policies outside of Israel, and when I support him, I'm going to say so. When I opposed Barack Obama, I said so. That's what bipartisan means, and I hope that we can maintain a sense of civility. The one great thing about my relationship with the Reverend Jerry Falwell is we were always civil and friendly toward each other. We listened to each other. I learned from him. I hope maybe he learned from me. That's the nature of dialogue. None of us was born with all the truth about every conceivable issue on our side. We learn from other people. And that's what's great about this assembly here today and what you do 80 times a year, I gather. You listen to different points of view. And in the end, there's only one person who can decide what you think is truth. And that is you, based on your experiences, based on your intellect, based on your assessment of the issues. That's why I think it's so important that all voices be heard on university campuses. And I think many people would be shocked to know that Liberty University is more diverse in its opinions than Harvard University.
You know, that same fella I just mentioned from New York said last night, he gave me the same advice, because I was on vacation last week with my family, and when I get bored on vacation, I start Twitter fights. And so,
Yeah.
And he happens to be our PR, he owns our PR firm in New York, Liberty's PR firm. So he said, Jerry, I'm so proud of you this week. I haven't seen you on Twitter. I said, it's because I've been busy.
Well, see, my wife won't let me get on Twitter. Mm-hmm. She says if you want to tweet something, you have to pass it by me, you have to pass it by your assistant, and now she says you have to pass it by your lawyer. So I don't tweet that much. I do a little bit, but I get the approval, most importantly, of my wife, and that keeps me under control. Otherwise, I'd be Donald Trump.
My wife gave up. She actually stopped following me on Twitter.
That's the ultimate insult in the world of cyber today, right?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Can't agree on everything. But, yeah, you and my father both agreed strongly on the issue of Israel. And one thing I would appreciate about you is you've stayed so consistent over the years, and you haven't drifted one way or the other in your views or in what you say. You just have stayed true to your core beliefs, and that's rare.
Can I give you an example of that? People are shocked to know that you know, I wrote a book which got me into a lot of trouble with my liberal friends, and particularly my friends on Martha's Vineyard. I wrote a book called The Case Against Impeaching Trump. That was not the original title. The original title was The Case Against Impeaching Hillary Clinton. Why? Because like most other Americans, I thought Hillary Clinton would be elected. And I remember that the Republicans were saying on day one, as soon as she's inaugurated, we're going to start impeachment proceedings against her. So I decided to write a book against using impeachment against Hillary Clinton. Well, it didn't work out that way, and Trump got elected president. So I wrote the same book, I just changed the name from Clinton to Trump. That proves my consistency. But my publisher, in addition to these two covers, The Case Against Impeaching Trump and Clinton, my publisher came up with a third cover. It's a brown paper envelope so that people on Martha's Vineyard could read my book without being ostracized. Nobody would know that they were actually reading my book. That's how bad it's become. If you say anything that's perceived as supportive of Trump, you're an enemy. If you say anything that's perceived as not supportive of all liberal Democrats, you're an enemy. It's like picking sides. Tonight, everyone in this room is going to be rooting for liberty in the basketball game. There's no compromise. Nobody here is going to say, on the one hand, Mississippi State, on the other hand, liberty. It's all liberty, every day, all the time. That's okay when it comes to sports. That is not okay when it comes to life and politics and trying to keep America the leading country in the world.
You know, Ted Koppel the other night said that the mainstream press, I think he named the New York Times and Washington Post, had really become, they weren't newspapers anymore. They just, every article, not every article, many articles are just opinion pieces. And
there's no question about that. The New York Times has become untrustworthy when it comes to reporting the news. I have to tell you, it's worse than that. The New Yorker, which was once a great magazine, has now become a political organ of the hard left. They've just commissioned a hit piece on me because I support Netanyahu, I support Israel, I support the civil liberties and civil rights of Trump, and the editor of The New Yorker hates me for it. So he commissioned a piece to attack me.
Wait till he finds out you spoke at Liberty. Wait till he finds out you spoke at Liberty.
Good. I'm very proud of that. I hope he puts that in the article. But it's true. Today, my wife and I, when we watch like the State of the Union, we'll have two televisions on. We'll watch it on CNN, we'll watch it on Fox. Then we'll watch the commentary afterward, and it's as if you saw two different speeches. I don't know how many of you know the name Walter Cronkite. He was the greatest journalist in modern mid-century America, and he was known for his objectivity. He couldn't get a job today. He wouldn't get a job on a network. He couldn't get a job writing for a newspaper because he's too nuanced. He's too centrist. He never took sides. He reported the news as the news deserved to be reported. And we're living in an Orwellian age today when the news and the media have become weaponized against political enemies. The criminal justice system, which I have been teaching for 50 years, has become weaponized. If you don't like somebody's politics, indict them. That's been the mantra. Whether you're a Democrat who wants to indict Trump or a Republican who wants to indict Hillary Clinton, that's not the answer. The answer is argue with them, participate in the court of public opinion, make your points known, and then people will decide, after hearing all the arguments, what the truth is. And that's what's so difficult today, and where I don't envy your generation. Your generation is going to have a very, very hard time distinguishing truth from fantasy. And you're going to have to work harder than we had to work. When I was a kid, you could pick up the New York Times. Maybe you'd want to read the Wall Street Journal as well. But today, I can't tell you the name of a newspaper, or a television station, which if you watched or read that alone, you would be able to make an honest assessment about what's going on in the world. You are challenged by that, and that's why it's so important for you, more than my generation, more than the generation of people on this stage, to think for yourselves.
You know, in the 2016 election, we ran an opinion piece, and the newspaper, Liberty owns a newspaper here on campus. We ran a piece for all three candidates, an opinion piece written by different students for all three candidates. But we got accused of censorship because we didn't run 2 for Hillary and 1 for the other 2. And so I'm pointing out, I mean, when I see what happens at the Washington Post and New York Times, they make decisions every day that are slanted in one direction. But yet when a conservative just does something as simple as one article for each candidate, we're accused of censorship. So it's a different standard, and it's, as conservatives, I think you young people are gonna have to deal with the double standard. Anything you do will be, it's even the least bit questionable, you'll be condemned for it. But while people on the other side get a pass, and that's just, it makes your careers and your lives harder, and it's something you're gonna have to deal with until there's some kind of monumental change in the open-mindedness and the dedication to the First Amendment in this country that we used to have.
Yeah, and the other thing I would urge you is do not let them push you around. If they're going to condemn you, stand up to them, fight back. Even if you do things and say things that I fundamentally disagree with, I will support you and defend you, and every good civil libertarian should. The American Civil Liberties Union used to do that. Now they're bought and paid for by the anybody but Trump campaign, get Trump at any cost campaign. The ACLU is not standing up for civil liberties on college campuses. It's not standing up for due process. It's not standing up for free speech. And that's why you're going to have a very thick skin. Look, to be a Christian in America is to develop a thick skin today. To be a committed Jew in America is to develop a thick skin. You're being trained to do that. But don't ever let them push you around. Even if you get a job with the liberal media and everybody there is a liberal, stick to your principles. Remain true to your beliefs. Be open to other points of view. Maybe you'll change. Maybe you'll become a liberal. Maybe you'll become a radical leftist. Who knows? You are free to do that as long as you do it from your own free will. As long as you don't do it as the result of being pressured by other people.
And it's tougher, I agree. Yeah. And it's tougher at your age to have a thick skin. I remember when you get our age, you let things roll off your back. But I remember going with my father when he spoke at Harvard, Yale, Columbia, even at my law school, at UVA Law School. He wasn't deplatformed, but
I introduced them at Harvard.
Oh, did you?
Yes.
Okay. But well, then we have met before. But he got booed and hissed some. Right. And I remember
particularly do you remember? A young woman got up and said, "I am your nightmare. I am a lesbian, communist, atheist." And do you remember that? And he handled it brilliantly. But I remember that day at Harvard because I was there.
I just remember it was. That's a great memory. I just remember at UVA Law School, I happened to be a student when he spoke there. So I was sitting there with my fellow students, and you know, he was getting some heckling and some boos, and I just remember, you know, I took it pretty hard because I was with my classmates, and somebody that was with us, traveling with my father, said, "Look, you might think this is tough, but you're gonna see a lot more of this as you get older, and your skin's gonna get thicker and thicker, and you just you have to get to the place where you don't let it affect you." And it was good advice.
It's not easy to follow. It's easy advice to give, but when you're in the vortex of the storm and everybody is screaming at you, and everybody is saying that you're, and then they use terrible words to describe you. It's not easy, and you won't find it easy because you're going to want people to like you. Reverend Falwell had a way about him. No matter how much criticism there was, he would have that smile. And he knew, because he had faith, that he could defend himself and support himself. It's not so easy to do, and you're going to have to work hard on accomplishing it.
Especially when you're young, because you're worried about your future legacy and your future reputation.
Look, when I wrote my first petition against executing the Rosenbergs in the McCarthy period, my mother and father thought my career was over, that I'd have a permanent record as a communist supporter, even though I hated communism. But I thought I had to do it as a matter of principle, and thankfully we live in America. It would have hurt me if I had lived in the Soviet Union or in Iran or in other places in the world, but in America, you are respected for standing by your principles.
I liked your opinion on the ideas that have been thrown out recently about the Supreme Court, about stacking it or changing the number of members. And I think what I read is that you said all the options to change probably have more downsides that we haven't thought of than upsides.
Right.
And you made a great point. Back when the framers wrote the Constitution, the average lifespan was, 40, 50 years old? And so when somebody was appointed to the Supreme Court, it was near the end of their lives.
That's right.
And now they serve for sometimes 30, 40, 50 years.
That's right.
And so that is a different, it's a different world we live in. But talk more about that, about the ideas to stack it, to change it. Somebody said one of the ideas I saw in your article was have 5 Republicans, 5 Democrats, and let them choose 5 centrists. But how do you decide who's really a centrist? I mean, how do you know if they're telling the truth?
I would be opposed to that because it would increase the politicization of the Supreme Court. I would like to see if we could ever get back to a time when there were 9 justices who were all nonpartisan. There's a great story about when President Herbert Hoover, who was a very underrated president, he helped save Europe after the First World War, but he was president during the Depression, so obviously his legacy has been tarnished. But when Oliver Wendell Holmes, who was probably the greatest modern justice, retired from the Supreme Court after serving on it forever and ever, the president asked his attorney general to give him a list of the 10 most qualified judges in the country to replace Oliver Wendell Holmes. And it was a great list. The very last name on the list was Benjamin Cardozo. And President Hoover, who was a Republican, looked at the list and told the attorney general, "It's a great list, but you have it upside down. I want to appoint Cardozo." And the attorney general says, "Well, you can't. He is a liberal Democrat. You're a conservative Republican. He is Jewish. We already have a Jew, Brandeis, on the Supreme Court." And the president said, "I don't care. He's the most qualified person in America to serve on that court and to replace Oliver Wendell Holmes." And he appointed him, and he became a centrist, non-ideological, objective, neutral. I want to go back to those days where the Supreme Court is not seen as Republican justices versus Democratic justices. I want every justice to be an American justice.
Well, I agree. But you also mentioned that you might favor term limits for Supreme Court justice. Do you feel the same way about congressmen and senators?
I do. I think term limits in general are very, very useful ways of creating kind of intellectual diversity in office. Also, nobody should serve in any office for 30, 40 years. It's just too much. You can be the president of a university for 30 or 40 years or a minister, but when it comes to government, nobody should serve that long. And particularly what we see now is presidents appointing younger and younger people in order to maintain their influence for as long as possible. And I don't think that should be the case. I think if we could do it without amending the Constitution, I would favor 15-year terms for the Supreme Court or staggered terms so that every president gets to make at least one appointment to the Supreme Court. It's an interesting story. When Jimmy Carter was elected, he had a list, and according to at least Newsweek magazine, I was on the list of possibilities to be appointed. Carter never got to appoint a single justice to the Supreme Court. He's the only president in modern history who never got to appoint a single a justice. So there are a lot of things, but on balance, if you ask me, should we tinker with the Supreme Court, I would say no. If you're going to amend the Constitution already, then I would say term limits, but I wouldn't start by doing that. I think the Bill of Rights particularly should never be tinkered with. They are wonderful, wonderful documents of freedom and liberty. Everybody disagrees with some of them. Many liberals disagree with the Second Amendment on guns. Many conservatives disagree, say, with the privilege against self-incrimination or separation of church and state. By the way, on separation of church and state, here's an issue. We may have some disagreement. I think the great reason why America is the most religious Western democracy in the world is because we have separation of church and state. If you don't have separation, then you blame the church on the government's failings. You blame the government on the church's failings. I think countries that have separation of church and state, religion thrives far more. We are the most religious country in the world. And if I have one criticism of Israel today, it's that there is not enough separation, that the chief rabbinate of Israel has too much influence on personal matters like divorce and custody of children. So I think we are blessed. We are blessed with separation. It's good for America. It's good for religion. Remember, the term separation of church and state comes from a religious minister, Roger Williams, who talked about not having the garden, meaning the church, influenced by the weeds and the forests of government. Keep the government out of the life of churches. You are all, many of you are evangelicals. That means you have a job to do. You have to persuade people to be Christians. And if you persuade them, you've prevailed. You don't need the help of the government. You don't need the help of the law. You have religion on your side. Go out and persuade. You know, it's interesting. Sometimes I hear criticisms from my friends who are Jewish who say, why are you so close to evangelical Christians? Don't you know they're trying to convert you? I say, make my day. Go ahead. Try. If you prevail, okay. As long as I have the freedom to maintain my religion, as long as the government isn't compelling me to do it, I have no objection to you trying to enter the marketplace of religion and trying to convert people to your way of life. As long as I'm free to make my own decision, I have absolutely no problem with that.
And that's why I agree. But that's why Liberty puts a strong emphasis on apologetics, because it shows the historical proofs of what we believe, what really happened with Jesus. But that's not what I want to talk about. This is Thomas Jefferson country. And so when you talk about separation of church and state, I learned something about it only because we had to sue the state of Virginia to change the Virginia Constitution in 2002 because churches could only own 50 acres of land in any city. And the church that my father pastored needed to own more than that. And so we did some research on it, and we found out the reason that restriction was there goes back to Thomas Jefferson. Before the Revolution in Virginia, every citizen had to be a member of the Anglican Church.
Right.
Every citizen had to pay tithes.
Right.
And so the church bought up, I don't know, maybe most of the land in Virginia. And so after the Revolutionary War, Thomas Jefferson confiscated all those lands, never compensated the Anglican Church, and he also put it in the Constitution of Virginia that churches could never incorporate. Well, in those days, no organization could own land unless it was incorporated. So, for years, churches couldn't own even 1 acre. In the 1850s, the Virginia Supreme Court changed it so that a church could the church could go to the judge, have trustees appointed. The trustees could hold a property, but they couldn't sell it or borrow against it, couldn't do anything without court permission. The number of acres increased over the years, but that process, that rule was still in effect in 2002. And what we learned is the reason Jefferson was so determined for churches never to own land is because the English government, the British throne, had used the church to create legitimacy for itself.
Sure.
The king appointed the archbishop of the Anglican Church.
And the king is the defender of the faith. That's
Right.
his title, defender of the faith.
And so what they did is they used the church to tax people through tithes. And Thomas Jefferson never wanted to see that happen again. He never wanted to see the government control the church. So when he talked about separation of church and state, he wasn't saying he didn't want the church to influence the government. He was saying he didn't want the government to have control of the church.
No, that's absolutely right.
But that whole argument's been turned on its head.
Look, the churches can try to influence the government as much as they can. They are advocacy groups. You're entitled to. You're first-class citizens in America. You're entitled to try to persuade government to accept your views as long as there's no compulsion involved. Thomas Jefferson was an incredibly great man. I own one of his personal letters he wrote on the 25th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, talking about freedom of religion and freedom of speech. It's one of my most valued and treasured possessions. I actually wrote a whole book about it with a funny title called Finding, Framing, and Hanging Jefferson, because I found the letter, I framed it, and then I hung it on my wall. So I love Thomas Jefferson, and I love to be in Thomas Jefferson country.
Yeah.
Makes me feel really good.
That's why there's so much red brick around here.
Right.
Yeah. But that was what he meant by separation of church and state. He didn't mean that if a certain jurisdiction wanted to put the Ten Commandments up on a courtroom wall, that they couldn't do it.
Well, we disagree about that.
Okay. I knew I'd find something.
See, I would put 4 of the commandments up. I don't mind putting don't kill, don't rob. What I have a problem with is on a governmental church, thou shalt have no other God before you, do not make unto thee a sacred image. I'm even happy with respect your father and mother.
Or maybe
so
maybe
I like about 5 of the commandments.
Maybe that's a bad example. Or a cross out in the park or something.
Yeah, no, I think that crosses, Stars of David. And remember, every time you agree to have a cross on a public building, you also agree to have a Muslim symbol, a Jewish symbol, an atheist symbol, because we can't favor one religion over another. What I much prefer is have the cross on private property adjoining the public sphere. Every year I light the Hanukkah candles in Miami Beach on a piece of land that's owned privately, and the menorah is put up privately, but it's in a public space. I think accommodation between religion and government and civil society is essential without the thumb of religion being too heavily integrated and entwined with the state. But reasonable people could disagree.
Because then there's strings attached on the church.
There's always strings attached.
On the church.
Right, always.
Yeah.
You know, he who pays the piper calls the tune. If the church gets money, they're going to have to do something, just like universities. When universities get money, they have to follow the rules.
That's true. These students all get federal financial.
Right, and good.
We don't get hardly any federal research money directly.
Right.
But you remember in the 80s, the big criticism of conservatives, like my father, was you can't legislate morality, and on issues like abortion and family values. Well, now it seems like I hear arguments from the left that because Jesus said help the poor, we should legislate that morality on all the citizens and tax everybody to give to the poor. So it's like it's turned.
Oh, yeah. Look, everybody picks and chooses. You pick your favorite part of the gospel and you say we want that to be legislated or incorporated. My own view is you're great advocates. Advocate for your position. You're very persuasive. You're going to persuade people. You don't need the heavy hand of government, because the heavy hand of government comes with a hand being held out to and saying, if we do this for you, you're going to have to do this for us. So I stand by my separation of church and state and my support for religious advocacy in the public sphere. Do your job, render unto Caesar. That's obviously what Jesus said, and it's a very, very good, I think, mantra for governance as well.
I think it means good citizenship, and I say that all the time, and it got to the point that they would laugh a little bit when I said it, because I said it so often, render unto Caesar.
Right.
But how are we doing on time, David?
You want to ask me about OJ? You want to ask me about OJ? Okay.
I forgot to let David ask any questions. I was just having so much fun.
We're having too much fun up here. But I know David has one question he wanted to ask me. So
I really just have enjoyed learning from both of you. I thought it's been amazing. I think what was interesting is when we announced that you were going to be with us, the number one question that the students wanted to make sure we asked is about O.J. Simpson. You know, you were on the dream team.
Okay.
And so I guess just because of respect for time, let's just go ahead and get to it. Was O.J. guilty or not?
So you're not the first person to ask me that question. Let me tell you what happened back in 1996 when Benjamin Netanyahu was elected Prime Minister of Israel. I've known him since he's 22 years old. He called me into the office with my wife and my daughter to take pictures and say hello. Then he took me into his private room, and he said, "So, Alan, I have a very important question to ask you." I thought it would be about Iran or about the Palestinians. He said, "Alan, did O.J. do it?" And I said, "Mr. Prime Minister, does Israel have nuclear weapons?" He said, "Well, you know I can't tell you that." I said, "Aha, you know I can't tell you that." So we both agreed to keep a secret. But let me explain to you in 30 seconds why O.J. was acquitted despite the overwhelming evidence of his guilt. They found a pair of socks, black socks like the ones I'm wearing, right in front of his bed, and the black socks were analyzed, and they had on them the blood of O.J. Simpson and the blood of his victims. My God, could you come up with a better piece of evidence? It's overwhelming. You can't possibly be innocent if you have the blood of the victims along with your blood on the sock. There was only one problem. Two problems. Number one, the sock, the blood on the sock had a chemical called EDTA, which is an anticoagulant, which is not found in the human body. It's found because it'll kill you. It's a blood thinner. It's what's used for rat poisoning. But it's found in test tubes. That is, when you pour blood into a test tube, you put EDTA in it so that the blood won't coagulate on the bottom. And we were able to prove, therefore, that an officer named Van Adder took the blood of O.J. Simpson and the blood in test tubes of the two victims and poured them on the sock when the sock was laying flat. How else would we prove it? Because if you think about this for a second, I'll have to stand up to show this to you. Wait a second. Okay, I got it. If you pour blood on a sock, wait. I've never had my legs approved of so much before. When you pour blood on a sock, you will find that it will splatter on this one side, and then there'll be a mirror image on the inside of the sock. But the third side of the sock and the fourth side of the sock that are separated by the leg will not have mirror images. The only way you'd get a mirror image blood transfer is if the sock was lying flat and the blood was poured on the sock while it was lying flat rather than while it was being worn. And we were able to demonstrate that all four sides of the sock had mirror image blood splatter. That led the jurors to conclude that there was an attempt to frame, now in the minds of many, to frame a guilty person, because the police thought he might get away with it because he had good lawyers and because maybe they would exclude certain other evidence. And so the police planned to frame somebody they thought was guilty. And several of the jurors said, we cannot vote to convict, even if we think the evidence is overwhelming, if we believe that the police planted evidence. So I want to put it to all of you. Let's assume you're the O.J. Simpson jurors, and you've come to two conclusions. One, you think the other evidence proves beyond a reasonable doubt that Simpson was guilty, but you also believe beyond a reasonable doubt that the police deliberately planted evidence against him. How many of you vote to convict? Hands up.
Not many.
How many of you vote to acquit? How many of you have a hung jury? Okay. So I think that explains why at least some of the jurors voted to acquit. I don't think we won the O.J. Simpson case. I think the police and the prosecutors lost it. Now, we know under our Constitution it's better for 10 guilty to go free than for one innocent to be wrongly convicted, and I suspect that's what some of the jurors thought. Is it justice? Well, somebody is going to judge that when the time comes. Was it human justice? That's a very different issue.
Okay, I went way over. I'm sorry. But anybody else got anything that we forgot to ask? Just yell it out. What? I can't hear. What?
Hear it. It's getting out of hand.
Wendy's or McDonald's?
Oh. What do you like better, Wendy's or McDonald's?
I have to tell you, Katz's Delicatessen on the Lower East Side of New York, that's my favorite.
Well, we're so honored to have Alan here today, and I bet you learned more today than you learned all semester.
Thank you guys. Can we thank Alan for being here and being our guest? Fantastic.